Well, Stephanie, Ben, Drew, thank you for joining me again for another episode of AI Calibration Weekly. I always enjoy y'all's perspective, and I always appreciate y'all's time. Today, we just got off one of our AI strategy meetings with all of our people, and Debbie, our CEO, showed us a presentation, an executive summary. I don't want to necessarily call it. I think we talked about how it wasn't necessarily a presentation, but it was an executive summary that she did for one of our clients recently. It was obviously redacted and all that, but she showed us what it was able to do. Her chatbot, essentially her version of Claude, with data that she put into it, with data that it ingested, and what appeared to be a pretty simple series of instructions. And I got to tell you, I was pretty wowed by it, and I can't get my Claude to do that. I think that's the thing that I'm wowed by, is like, that's there, and I think of myself as a pretty power user of these things, and I can't get my Claude to do that. How can normal human beings that aren't Debbie get that to work?
In a lot of ways, the AIs are kind of like having a human assistant, right? If you bring somebody in off the street and you just throw them in a chair and say, here, do a thing, right? If they don't have any context, if you haven't given them any instructions, you haven't told them what to do or how to do it or how you want it done, the results you're going to get are going to be wildly inconsistent. And so, and the AIs aren't that different in that respect, that you have to be able to give them some context. It has to have some understanding of what you want. It has to have some understanding of what it can work with. And I think in Debbie's case, especially, she's put in the time to, by working with her, that it has learned what she wants. It has learned a lot about how to operate and how to do things. And I think that context is just critical.
I want to dial into that a bit more because I think there's also another extension to it that Debbie's really strong at that we don't talk about enough, which is it's not just bringing the context, which is key. It's also about understanding what you want to get out of it. If you can't explain to it what you want it to do in a concise way that makes sense, then you're not going to get the results you're looking for. And I think one of the things that, somebody who has the experience of Debbie can go in and be like, I've sort of done this before. I know how this should look when it's finished, and I know what it takes to get there. Having that in your head, I think, makes that such a better process than when I go in and I'm like, I've never done this before. Can you help? And I fail. I fail miserably when I do that.
So
I'm in the process of building out in Claude, actually. So one of the things I do when I'm working with a new AI, one of my first agents I always build is a chief of staff agent. That's sort of my test case to see what it can do and how it does it. And so I'm doing that with Claude right now because I already have them in other AIs. And doing that in Claude has meant creating half a dozen Markdown files of, here's who I am, here's how I like to work, here's how I like to think, here's what I want you to do. And the result, I'm watching the results as I improve and build out these files, get better and better, just partly because I'm able to bring it that expertise and give it a clue. But I will say, to Drew's point, the process of building out those files has been incredibly valuable because it's forced me to think about how I do things and think about how I think about things and what I want. And in some cases, that's led me to new ideas about and clearer thinking about what is my expectations are. And so just the process of doing it has been educational for me and hopefully for the AI too.
I'm gonna extend off of that a little bit, Ben, and I hadn't really put this in my brain completely. Figuring out how you want something done and being able to explain it in a way that is quote unquote readable or understandable, that has actually helped me with it kind of intake or offloading my tasks to humans. I was able to articulate what was wrong in a specific task the other day that felt like kind of artistic preference. But I was able to articulate it because I have articulated that type stuff to our Claude, to my Chat GPT and things like that. But what do you mean by the Markdown files? Just in case people don't know what we're talking about, in case they haven't watched every episode here.
Yeah, sure. So the AI wants to have some context. It needs something to refer to, and so A Markdown file is sort of a fancy structured text file, basically. And you could do it with a text file also. In fact, I've experimented doing it both ways. And so essentially I'm just typing out in a structured way, here's who I am, here's what my role is, here are the projects I'm working on currently. And then below that, it's just literally bulleted lists of information and context that I'm giving the AI that it can refer to when we talk. So that's what the Markdown list is. It's really just kind of a fancy structured text file of information and context about me and what I'm doing. So that it knows that, so that when we're interacting, it can refer to it. If it was a person, I mean, if I just hired a human assistant, we'd sit down and have some coffee in a Danish and we'd talk about this stuff and they'd learn, and over the succeeding week or so, they'd figure out what it is I do here and how they help me. But in the AI's case, I have to write that stuff down in a structured file and upload it.
That's a good point. That's almost faster. Or could be, especially when you have it multiple times. It's like, yeah, you kind of have to get. I hadn't thought about the fact that when you get a new hire, they need to get used to you and figure out what you do and what your voice is. My associates and assistants, when I was practicing, could pretty well figure out what I was going to say in certain scenarios pretty easily because of that. Yeah.
Yeah, I don't know if Ben, if you've done this, but when I've switched, like we've leaned into several different tools here, and I too have kind of started leaning into Claude a lot more lately than Chat. But I went back to Chat and I was like, give me some instructions. Like, what does my new AI tool need to know about me? What would you tell it? And I actually use the AI to sort of inform the next AI, or even sometimes if I'm using a new tool, what information do you want to know about me, and help me think through it to create those files.
Yeah, 100%. One of the really valuable things that I've done with the AI is ask it, how can I tell you, what do you need to hear from me? Like, what can I tell you to help you work better? Yeah. That's great.
That goes to Drew's point of some of the things that Debbie's really good at. One of the things that I saw in her prompting, because she took us through what she was doing, was at the end, she said, help me replicate this. What will you need to know in the future? She actually said, wow, this is amazing to the bot. And it said, now help me replicate this. Help me create a system for doing this so somebody else on my team can do this same thing. What's the prompt? What's the data? What's the information in the back? And I think that really, in a lot of ways, is why a lot of Debbie's platforms like this are strong, because it's iterating.
I'm gonna throw in here though. Okay, here's the frustration part for me. Let's say that I take what Debbie just made, which is supposed to be the secret recipe, and I try to make the delicious cookies, and mine don't come out the same way, right? And I think that's the problem people run into as well. You've invested all this time in trying to make systems that are repeatable, and you take it to somebody else's system and it just doesn't work the same way. So I do want to just make sure, we understand kind of as a base level inside of these systems, there's kind of two different ways that you seed it with who you are and how you like to work. Ben spent some time talking about skills, which are kind of a special thing that Anthropic came up with for Claude, but are sort of like context files that the AI can choose to use. There's also personalization, which a lot of these different AIs have. And that's what Stephanie was referring to when she said, hey, ChatGPT, can you tell me about who I am and how I work? And that's that sort of automatic memory system that's also kept. And both of these things can be really valuable depending on how the AI saved who you are. It might be true that my system lives entirely in skills, or Ben's. And it may be that Stephanie's system's special sauce lives in memories. And trying to figure out where those things are and how to replicate them kind of requires knowing how to poke around those system settings and what's actually underneath.
So I saw this article in the Wall Street Journal last week. I think it was February 15th. And it says, workers are afraid AI will take their jobs. They're missing the bigger danger. And the thrust of this was that we, as the workers who are training our AI, that's not our intellectual property anymore. And we're essentially training ourselves out of our jobs. And so like now our company has, when I use my ChatGPT or my Claude, well, Affinity and Lawyerist have my special sauce or whatever. But with that, Drew, you were saying that you would like to kind of diagnose or quote unquote, like open up Debbie's ChatGPT. So like, where would you be looking for this type of stuff if you were to say, how do we replicate that?
So an AI system dissection should probably be going to settings. There's going to be personalization settings, which include memories and maybe also what you may have chosen you want the conversation tone to be, whether that's direct or, creative. And then you've got these bundles of skills, and those can live in the settings as well. They can sometimes be attached to certain threads. Some AI systems also have like projects, which are, special sets of chats that have a shared set of context. So there's a lot of different things that you can pack or unpack from these. And I think the big thing is each system does it in a different way, but they're all sort of getting at the same thing, which is how does it know you and how you work? And you can find that usually by looking underneath the hood in some of those system settings.
Okay. And so I could potentially, like Stephanie's saying, transport that a little bit from one to another.
I think, too, the message I would tell people is don't give up, because I think what often happens is somebody might be hearing us talking and saying, wow, it sounds like they're able to do really cool things. Let me go try. And that first attempt, or even that third or 10th attempt using a tool, they don't get it. They don't get what they want. And I think they also try to do it in a single shot, right? Which we talk about. Like they put in one prompt and want one result. And that isn't how we use these tools. Like we get in there. Sometimes I even say, like, I wrestle with it, right? Like it's a process. Like I'm leveraging the tool, but it's like I'm going to go in and I'm going to work on just like a piece of the content, maybe the intro, and we're going to keep working on that until I kind of massage it and get it where I want it. And then I feed it back and say, okay, here's the final, where I'm going with that. Now let me go to the next section. And I go section by section, and I mean, I kind of like it. It's fun, but it's a process. But now through that process, the tool is learning me and learning my language, and we're getting to a better work product. I had a client recently who I was explaining this to, and they were kind of like, oh, I get it now. And they also they were going to work on a tax opinion, and fed a couple of recent ones that they had done to the tool, like Drew was saying, I think inside the project. So it had those templates. It knew what done looked like. And then he went in and he did just what I said. And he didn't just try to say, write me the 10-page tax opinion. He kind of went and worked with it in smaller sections. And ultimately, he told me he got to a work product that he felt was like 95% there in 3 hours instead of 10. So when you hear about people, so it doesn't take it down to 5 minutes. I think there's some misconceptions out there too about what this work really looks like when you dig in. So yes, he was able to do that work and do it a lot faster, but it's not like you just go and say, write me this opinion and magic happens. It's still a tool that you use.
To me, that sounds like something that we were talking about earlier as well, is like knowing how to ask the right question at the right time, instead of, just the broad open-ended question, or asking it to do the thing that it can do. I know Sam Harden, one of our people that's on this show a good bit, he has kind of gotten his Claude to be able to do some PowerPoint presentations because he asks it to do what he knows it can do, which is replace brackets, replace things, and have placeholders and stuff like that. Whereas when I go into Copilot and I ask it to create PPTs, it's absolute trash. Because I just say, please make me a PPT that looks like this one example, So I think it's asking the right questions as well.
And some of that's laying that groundwork of here's what done should look like, as Stephanie put. Here's what it should look like. Here's how I like to do it. And each person's preferences are going to be a little bit different. One of the really powerful use cases are things like Copilot, those productivity AIs, is things like triaging your email. But one of the places I see people fail with that all the time is they say, hey, Copilot, what are the 5 most important emails in my inbox right now? And then it gives you 5 emails and you look at those and you go, well, those aren't that important. Well, it's because you haven't told Copilot, what does important mean to you, right? And so, some of that's Copilot learning by whatever mechanism you give it. What does important mean to you? And so getting that additional context is so important.
By the way, this applies to humans as well, because I spend a lot of my time teaching people how to delegate and how to work with others, how to do an onboarding process. Lawyers are notorious for saying, here's your desk, welcome to the new firm, here's a computer, now go do work. And then they're frustrated when work comes back and doesn't look exactly like they think it should. It's like, well, did you give them any context or instructions? Because we don't appreciate always that our brains work differently. So how I approach a project is going to be vastly different than the way you three would approach the project, which also then shows up in my prompting and would show up if I was giving that work to the associate down the hall. I had to learn, it took me a while in my practice to learn that I can't just say write a motion. I would to a new associate, I would have to say, here's the process. First, we're going to do this, and then we're going to do this, and here's why we're doing that. And then we're going to, right? Like, this whole thing. That's not micromanaging, by the way. A lot of people are so worried about micromanaging, they just say, let me just dump this on you. And so I think it's interesting because we're so bad at delegating in real life, which is going to also then show up in how we try to delegate to these AI tools. The same principles apply.
I couldn't agree more. And I think one thing I want to, extend on this is what's really become valuable because of AI is having a mental model of a process or like a framework. Because Stephanie, what you just described is somebody who can do work really well themselves. But if they were, put on trial and asked to explain how they do that work, they couldn't do it. And they couldn't make it so that somebody else can replicate their work product. The people who do have the strategic mindset, who've gone through and, mapped out that process so that others can do it before, they now have that skill to be able to do that with AI. And I think that's another crazy thing that a lot of leaders find it super helpful because they've gone through those processes and they have those frameworks and mental models in their head. And a lot of us don't yet. And we haven't taken the time to really kind of codify how do we do the things we do and how do we think through what we do. And that's a piece of our secret sauce that maybe we can't even put in the chatbot.
I think there's also an interesting challenge / opportunity in that, I've always told people with the AI, give it as specific instructions as possible, right? And it's occurred to me over time that sometimes there's value in letting the AI have a little leash and see what it does, right? And so when you're talking about mapping out those processes, yes, absolutely, there's a tremendous amount of value in mapping out that process. But there can also be some value in saying, you know what, I'm going to leave this step a little bit vague. I know how I do it, but I want to see how you do it. And maybe you have a better way to do it than I do. And the trick, of course, is figuring out where those opportunities are, right? And also then being able to evaluate the output and go, yeah, no, my way was better. After all, versus also being able to be honest about it and say, well, actually what you came up with there is interesting and maybe I should tweak the way I do it. So I think there's kind of that interesting balance and opportunity there of both mapping out, here's exactly how I do it versus let's see what your solution is to this problem. How do you get there?
So I have a particular prompt that I give to some of our labsters in order to help them do their SOPs, because a lot of this, we're circling around the idea of SOPs, right? Whether it's your kind of personal SOPs or your team SOPs. And I would suggest people take their personal SOPs and make them team SOPs because we have a tendency to silo that knowledge. But I have a prompt that I use that actually brings in what you're talking about, Ben, is the help of the chatbot or the LLM to kind of work around how should I do this also? How do I do it? And how should I do it? Is there a better way? And so in that back and forth, that wrestling, as Stephanie says, we can kind of get to a better way of doing these things. But I think having those SOPs in a place where the LLMs can find them, can access them, that becomes your like you said, Markdown docs, Ben. And so the companies that already have SOPs in place, great, make them better. But I've spent years trying to get attorneys to write their SOPs and write them well, organized in the right place and drew kind of to which is like structured in a way that makes sense and can make sense to these LLMs as well.
I think there's also some interesting opportunity to be able to take your SOP and show that plus a couple of examples of the desired output to the AI and say, can you suggest ways to improve this process? And you might look at those suggestions and go, nah, no. But in some cases, the AI is going to come back and go, you could do this step differently, or you could combine these two steps, or it may come up with some solutions or some suggestions that you go, oh, okay, yeah, that makes it better. One of the things I've been doing a lot of lately is when I teach a class, an AI class, and it's a class I do, 10 times a month. I'll take the transcript of that and I'll upload it to the AI and I'll say, evaluate this. What did I overlook? Is there anything I could have done better here? And oftentimes it comes back and says, you talked about this, but you didn't talk about that. You might want to mention that next time, or you spent a long time on this, but there didn't seem to be a lot of value there. Let's, switch that. So anyway, it comes back and gives me some interesting feedback to just help me make small improvements and tweak it the next time. Sometimes asking the AI to evaluate it will come back with some useful suggestions. Some of the suggestions, not so much, but still, it's fast and easy way to get some feedback and perspective you might not have had otherwise.
Yeah, there's very little cost to that.
Yeah. There's another layer we can add into all this too. And maybe we're getting super complex, but that's kind of the point, is that these AI tools, as you start to unravel it, you can start to add complexity, which is something that some of us talked about yesterday after we had an internal presentation. Is what if you took those SOPs, also layered on your preferred voice and those kinds of things, but then also layered on, and let me tell you about my client or my audience. Maybe I'm writing to this judge or to opposing counsel, and here's what you need to know about them. Here's their posture. Here's how they might approach this. Use that information and, make my argument stronger. Or how do I make this more persuasive? Or my client's worried about these specific things, so in this case, I need to really, emphasize that. Or they're coming from a scarcity mindset. I mean, we can fill in the blank, but then being able to layer in kind of what's going on in the head of the person who might be reading our work product adds a whole nother layer of fun and complexity to what the AI is going to be able to give us.
Well, that's one of those places, Stephanie, that we talk about a lot, where it's like, we wouldn't do this without AI. We'd want to. It'd be ideal to be able to have your kind of like individual client profile or individual judge profile. It would be great to do that, but we don't have the time to do that. Well, now we do. That's one of those things that AI doesn't necessarily save you time. As Ben says, it do it faster, better, and sometimes both. But this is a better place. You do more with it. I think that's a wonderful idea. Well, before we go, this time, instead of giving people specific homework or ideas, I want to tell people where they can find each of y'all. The three of y'all do a lot of writing and a lot of thought work. And so, Stephanie, where can people find you online or in the interwebs?
Yeah, I would head to LinkedIn first. Maybe there's show notes and we can put this. I think I'm Stephanie A. Everett. I should know that.
We'll have it in the show notes. Definitely. This isn't an audio file, so it'll be there. Ben, how about you? I know you do a lot on LinkedIn as well.
Yeah, primarily on LinkedIn, and then I guess secondarily on Blue Sky is right. I am somewhat, but yeah, I would say LinkedIn is definitely the best starting point for me too.
And last but not least, Drew.
You can find me on LinkedIn. The posts are rare, but hopefully valuable when they come out. So
love it. And as you can imagine, you can find me on LinkedIn, or you can find all three of these guests here on AI Calibration Weekly. And Stephanie and I do a show on our sister channel for Lawyerist, and you can find us on the Lawyers Podcast. Ben, Drew, Stephanie, once again, thanks for being with me this week. I appreciate it.